Disaster can strike at any time. 1 minute, it's just another day. A split second later, lives are changed forever. There's an old saying that misery loves company. This is never more true than during one black week in October 1913. October 1913. Europe and the world is experiencing a period of great change.
It's a period during which new industries and new technologies are transforming social existence. The telegraph, wireless communication. It's a period of immense population growth and of movement of people from countryside to city and from Europe to the New World.
Europe is undergoing very rapid industrialization and urbanization, so people's lives in some cases are being changed by these kind of forces. And Europe's obviously moving in the sense that a large proportion of Europe's population are changing their residence in various ways.
Immigrants from all parts of Europe are looking for a new life in the new world. Many are trying to escape extreme poverty, rigid social division, and religious persecution.
Add to this the fact that competition between shipping lines was depressing the cost of the passage, and that again helps to explain why there were so many migrants.
October 2nd, 1913. The steamship Volturno leaves the Dutch port of Rotterdam. Built as a cargo boat in 1906, it also carries passengers, with a stopover in Halifax and New York.
Volturno was a very hard-working tramp, not a luxury liner. Rather, she was there for the working class and for the regular trade of carrying cargoes and people economically across the North Atlantic.
Captain Francis Inch is in charge of the 93 crewmen on board. This is his first command, a position he has held for only a month. His first officer is H.P. Miller from New York. Miller's wife is also at sea, on her way home from visiting relatives in England. She is on another passenger ship, the Kroonland, because of a rule which forbids wives from sailing on the same ship as their husbands. The Volturno carries enough lifeboats and rafts for 1,000 occupants. On this trip, there are just half that many passengers, 562.
They're going on a long sea voyage, for which they have no experience at all. I mean, most of these people have never left the village before they travel across the Atlantic.
Frida Greyboys is among them, sailing to New York with her young son and daughter to meet her husband, who left Russia 8 months earlier.
The ones that came over in the Volturno was my grandmother, Frida, my dad, Nissel, and my aunt, Clara, or Kriva, according to the manifest. They were steerage passengers, and from other information I have that from other sources said everybody stayed in cabins of one sort or another.
A young office clerk from Germany also travels in steerage. His name is Walter Trentapol, and this is one sea voyage he will never forget. October 9th. The Volturno is in the mid-Atlantic, 600 miles from where the Titanic went down the year before. Seas have been rough for the past few hours, but Captain Inch is not concerned. The Volturno has weathered many storms in her time, and she can weather this one. Most passengers are still asleep in their cabins when ship steward Willie Reiswich makes his rounds at 6 a.m. He finds nothing out of the ordinary. In her hold in the forward part of the ship, the Volturno carries a large cargo of chemicals, wines and liquors, straw mats, and barrels of oil. But there is something else there, waiting for its chance to escape. 6:40 a.m. A crew member reports a strong smell of smoke coming from the number 1 hold. Captain Inch is alerted while crew members spray water in the direction of the smoke.
First, the captain was informed that there was a fire. He said, let's not warn the passengers, but try to fight it.
In their cabin, Frida Greyboys and her 2 children hear the commotion.
They weren't the first ones to discover the fire, but when they learned about the fire, then my dad said that he went and knocked on cabin doors, waking up people to get them out of their cabins so they can get to safety.
Back in the hold, Willie Reiswitz and the others are trying to put the fire out, but they are about to lose the battle.
A little after 7 o'clock, there was a terrific roar. A sheet of flame shot out that threw us all back. The tables and benches and steers were blown up, and the bulkhead caved in so that we could see the flames in number 1 hold.
The captain realized that he needed help, and he turned to the wireless, which had recently figured so prominently in the story of the Titanic in an effort to bring other ships.
78 miles away, the Cunard passenger liner, the Carmania, receives the Volturno's first SOS. Her captain, James Barr, orders full steam ahead, but for some of the passengers and crew of the Volturno, that will be too late. As they join the stampede up the stairs, Frida Greyboys and her children feel the push of the crowd. Walter Trentapole sees fellow passengers trampled underfoot or dragged back so another can take their place.
Passengers came up and the fire just spread. At one point, I think there was nothing separating them just except one iron floor, and the rest was like a furnace burning there. Since the fire was at the forward end, so the passengers escaped to the back of the ship. There was panic, so some people started to jump overboard. People just preferred to die by drowning and die by fire.
With the storm still raging, Captain Inch orders the launch of several lifeboats. Chief Officer H.P. Miller is put in charge of the first one over the side.
One of the things that struck me is them putting those boats in the water with the seas being so heavy. It's extremely difficult to put a boat in the water in heavy seas.
As Miller's boat reaches the water, a wave flips it over. Officer Miller is able to climb back in with several others, but without oars to guide her, he can only hold on as the boat is swept out to sea. Other lifeboats meet a similar fate. One is crushed like an egg under the ship's hull. Another makes it to the water but follows Miller's boat out to sea and disappears. The attempt to launch the lifeboats in an angry sea costs more than 100 lives. Captain Inch receives word by wireless that the Cunard passenger liner, the Carmania, is on its way. The message may well be the Volturno's last. As fire claws its way across the Volturno, Walter Trentapole fights his way to the deck. He is shocked by the chaos he finds. The loss of the lifeboats pushes many passengers to the brink. In desperation, one woman jumps overboard with her baby.
There is also a story of a French young couple. They embraced, they gave each other a farewell kiss, and in an embrace they jumped overboard and drowned.
As hysteria sweeps through the crowd, Frida Greyboys is surprisingly calm.
She decided she wasn't going to risk her life, running like a lot of people were running. And she decided she wasn't going to do that. She was going to sit and wait it out until somebody came along and rescued them.
As more passengers push into the ship's aft, Frida realizes she must protect her son and daughter.
My grandmother then gathered him and my aunt up and took them back aft to the rope locker where they store the ropes and stuff. And so she hid them in there to be away from the crowd.
When she returns, Frida notices a change in the mood of those around her. The Carmania has been sighted on the horizon 4 hours after receiving the Volturno's SOS. As his ship positions itself for rescue operations, Carmania Captain James Barr orders the launch of one of his lifeboats, manned by a crew of 10.
They know the peril that the people in the Volturno were in, and they were willing to give their lives to attempt to get them off right away.
The lifeboat is buffeted by the raging sea. 7 out of the 10 oars are broken or lost. After 2 hours, it returns to the Carmania empty-handed.
It had to be a traumatic time for the people aboard the ship, and the rescuing people not being able to get to the other ship and get lines onto the other ship and things like that. I'm sure they were saying their prayers.
By 6 that evening, 3 more ships respond to the call. All try to lower lifeboats, but the seas are too rough. The third ship is the Kroonland, a passenger liner from the Red Star Fleet, also bound for New York from Antwerp. One of its passengers, the wife of First Officer H.P. Miller, watches the Volturno burn, unaware that her husband is already among the dead. By 6:30 p.m., brasswork and glass on the Volturno has melted, and much of the woodwork has burned and collapsed. Only a steel barrier separates the passengers on deck from the inferno seething in the hold below. In desperation, Captain Inch asks for volunteers to launch another lifeboat. His intent is to show the other ship captains that a boat can survive the boiling seas. There are 5 volunteers, including ship steward Willie Reiswitz. They battle wind and waves for over an hour, but eventually reach the Grosser Kurfürst.
They were put on board on a ladder, a rope ladder, which was left down. And immediately after, that lifeboat crashed against the big ship. They just managed to get them in time.
By 9 p.m., searchlights on the Carmania help illuminate the area as more ships answer the call. In total, 10 ships come to the rescue on their way to New York from Liverpool, Bremerhaven, and Le Havre, but they have all arrived too late to save the Volturno. October 9, 1913, 9:30 p.m. Another explosion rocks the Volturno as fire reaches explosives on the ship's bridge. In a panic, German office clerk Walter Trentopol jumps into the ocean with another passenger and a member of the crew.
And he first swam to the Grosser Kurfürst, the German ship. But no one heard him because of the sea being so wild.
Trentopol and the other men swim for the Carmania, but when a searchlight finds him in the water close to the ship, Walter Trentopol is alone.
And he managed to get on board. The others were just too fatigued and they just went with the current, so they didn't make it.
For those left on the Volturno, the night is long, dark, and frightening. For some, it is tragic.
And there was a woman carrying her baby in her arms that fell asleep against the rail. And when she woke up, the baby had gone. It had rolled off the ship.
Encouraged by the rescue of Trentopol and the others, several ships eventually send lifeboats close enough to the Volturno to urge survivors to jump.
There was a woman also with a child, and she threw her child overboard, hoping that it would go into the boat. It didn't. It fell into the sea. But there was one man in that lifeboat who reacted instantly, jumped in, and finally did save that small baby.
When morning arrives on October 10th, a firestorm still rages on the deck of the Volturno, but the storm at sea has passed. The oil tanker Narragansett begins pumping hundreds of tons of oil around the burning vessel.
The heavy weight of the oil keeps the water down and the waves from breaking too much. And then you're able to get your boats into the water better and with less chance of them being turned over. And after that happened, I guess then they were able to effect the rescue.
As Captain Inch begins separating the passengers into 2 groups, Frida Greyboys rushes to the Volturno's supply closet to retrieve her children.
They heard that when they were going to be rescued, that they were going to separate the men and the women. And so she dressed my dad up as a girl so that she can keep them together.
And she told me finally when they came to rescue, she had to go down on ropes. Her hands got raw, and the skin got raw, and, climbing down, clasping the rope tight in her hands. It must have been a terrible experience. And she's very fortunate that she got off safely.
520 passengers and crew are taken off the Volturno that October morning. Captain Francis Inch and the 2 wireless operators are the last to leave.
And they were picked up by all those various ships, which then of course also had different destinations, so they wound up in different ports. Some were on the way to the United States, but most of them were on the way to Europe.
Frida Greyboys and her children are brought back to Rotterdam. Eventually, arrangements are made for them to take another ship to New York.
Something that I thought was a coincidence is that although my grandfather came over 7 months before them, they ended up both coming on the same ship. He came on the Campanello, and then because of the incident, here they come on the Campanello.
So many families were separated. So a mother might have lost her children and worried for days where they were.
A total of 136 lives are lost, but many believe the number would have been higher if not for firefighting efforts that kept the burning ship afloat. And if not for wireless technology, the fate of the Volturno would have been one of the world's great mysteries.
The need to have wireless, the need to call for assistance, which had been so heavily underscored with the loss of the Titanic, was now augmented by the burning of Volturno and the rescue of so many people.
The cause of the fire is never determined, although speculation includes everything from spontaneous combustion to sabotage.
But it's reported that the crew had, I think, an argument over their wages or working conditions with the owners. And the owner then reported that we got threatening letters, and just 7 days after that letter, the Volturno gets on fire in mid-Atlantic.
7 days after the rescue, the Volturno sinks into the ocean to its final resting place, but its legacy lives on.
I think one of the things they learned from the Volturno disaster, you don't take a dangerous cargo like volatile chemicals and easily burnable materials and put them on a ship with so many hundreds of people. Ultimately, there came a segregation of dangerous cargoes and passengers that hitherto had not existed.
The Volturno disaster quickly becomes an international story, but it is only the beginning, a mere introduction to a week of terrible news, and a much greater tragedy about to unfold in a tiny Welsh town called Senghenith.
Trains are the key in some ways to Europe before 1914, because up until 1914, sea power had been the key to international power. What's happening at this time is that something else is developing, which is rail, which is opening up the great continental land masses.
It was transforming their lives in the sense that they're commuting to work. It's also transforming their leisure. Railways are transforming not just Britain, but the rest of Europe at this time.
Wednesday, October 15th, 1913. It is 5 days after the Volturno rescue. The Manchester Express prepares to leave Liverpool's Central Station at 2:30 p.m. Although the cars are full, they are safe. Each is equipped with a communication cord that passengers can pull if ever there's a problem. The Manchester Express leaves Liverpool Station right on time. The Midland train to Stockford prepares to follow on the same track 5 minutes later. William Thompson watches the Manchester Express pull out. A railway signalman for 34 years, it is his job to control the movement of trains in and out of the Liverpool block.
You divide the railway route up into a number of blocks. When you have allowed a train into one of these blocks, you do not allow another train into the block. And the train proceeds along the line, moving from block to block.
Two cars moving in the same direction cannot be in the same block because there is a greater potential for collision. It is the signalman's responsibility to prevent this. Once the Manchester train has left the station, Thompson leaves young train booker Edward Scholson at the controls of the Liverpool signal and block system.
Because Liverpool Central was a very busy box, all these signalmen were in the habit of allowing the train booker to assist them with the operation of the signalling system and the block instruments. This was strictly against the regulations. All the signalmen knew it, the train bookers knew it, and I suspect that there were company officials who knew what was going on but turned a blind eye.
2:32 p.m. As the Manchester train passes through a tunnel not far from Liverpool Central, a communication cord pulled in one of the coaches tugs at the vacuum brakes. In accordance with procedure, engineer Edward Howson pulls into St. James Station east of the main terminal.
But the driver stopped so that he and the guard could jointly inspect the train to find out what the problem was. The train was 8 carriages long. The last 2 carriages were stuck in the tunnel, and this meant that it was impossible to see whether the communication cord had been pulled in the last 2 carriages.
The signalman from St. James Station alerts Liverpool Central that the Manchester train has stopped. In the noisy terminal, William Thompson thinks he hears Scholson receive the all-clear signal. He pulls the switch, giving the Midland train the go-ahead to leave. Edward Scholson is surprised to see the Midland train pull away.
At 2:35, I looked up and asked the signalman where the Midland was going. I told him that the Manchester train had not cleared St. James. Thompson remarked, "Why did you not tell me?"
Well, I saw a mistake had been made, and I did my best to stop the Midland train. When I placed the advanced starting signal to danger, the train would have been just entering the tunnel.
The second train was probably only doing about 10 miles per hour. Even at 10 miles per hour, there was enough energy in the second train and the engine to smash and completely destroy the last 2 carriages of the first train.
On impact, the Midland engine derails and turns over.
6 people were killed outright or died of their injuries very shortly after the accident. 5 of them passengers, 1 of them a second guard who was traveling on the train.
An inquiry into the accident finds signalman William Thompson at fault.
He had assumed that the train booker had received the bell code from St. James's Station that the first train had left the block section and was safely on its way to Manchester. That hadn't happened. He'd worked as a signalman at Liverpool Central box for over 25 years. He makes one mistake and it had these tragic consequences.
At this time, there's about 1,000 deaths on British railways every year. So railway accidents have become a fact of life.
While accounts of the accident are in all the newspapers, they are overshadowed by a much more tragic event that first unfolds the day before, on Tuesday, October 14th, 1913. With the arrival of the 20th century, the Welsh countryside on Great Britain's west coast becomes carved and disfigured by underground mines, producing millions of tons of coal every year.
Wales is one of the big centres of the British Industrial Revolution, so it's an area of coal production, steel production.
The Universal Colliery in Senghenith is one of the deepest in the coal fields, producing some of the best steam coal in the country. The mine at Senghenith is so large that some of the work sites are as much as 2 miles from the main shafts, the Lancaster on the west side of the mine and the York on the east.
A mining community would be a relatively close-knit community. It's a community where people are bound together by very brutal common experiences. It's a society where people feel united by what they're going through.
Tuesday, October 14th, 1913. In Senghenith, fathers, sons, brothers, and friends make their way down the streets. They are part of the day shift, 950 men on their way to the Universal Colliery at the head of the Aber Valley. 31-year-old Joseph Lewis hugs his wife as he leaves his home on High Street. They are expecting their 5th child in a few months. He carries his favorite snuff box, since smoking is forbidden in the pit. The reason is the high accumulation of volatile coal dust. 12 years earlier, just after 5:30 on the morning of May 24th, 1901, an explosion ripped through the mine without warning and without mercy.
81 men were killed, and 50 of the 52 horses were killed. The death toll was practically 100%.
The Mine Act of 1911 is established after the explosion, regulating such things as shaft ventilation and coal dust removal. Mine owners are given ample time to put the new regulations in place, but Lord Mather, owner of the Universal Mine, is slow to act.
They were given until the 1st of January 1913 to implement it. On the 1st of January, it had not been done. They asked for an extension, and they were granted an extension until the 30th of September. By the 30th of September, it still hadn't been done.
Night crews have been assigned to clear the dust, but the sheer size of the work area makes it impossible.
There was a dust problem underground, and dust mixed with damp created a gas which just needed sparking and it would go off.
Despite the danger, Joseph Lewis and the other miners ride the winding cage down into the mine. "27-year-old Joe Davies is not among them. He is at home after switching shifts with a friend.
People switch shifts all the time. They worked as much as they could because they needed the money. Nobody'd ever take a day off, so they'd switch instead.
By 7:30 that morning, all 950 workers are below ground. 440 of them are working in the coal district of the Lancaster pit on the west side of the mine. The rest work out of the York shaft on the east side. Many are barely teenagers. 14-year-old Charles Baker works with his father just off the Lancaster pit. Farther along the shaft, teenager Evan Moore works with his father and older brother. As the men settle into what promises to be another long day, their wives tend to household chores. Their children head off to school. It begins somewhere in the west side of the mine, in the Lancaster shaft. Young Charles Baker and his father turn at the sound of the blast as it sprints through passageways, feeding on coal dust hanging in the air. In another part of the mine, Ernest Moses dives for cover behind several empty coal drams just before a second explosion. The second blast is much greater than the first. It splinters timber props like toothpicks and destroys everything in its path.
First explosion probably didn't do a lot of damage. It just caused the ignition point for coal dust for the main explosion. And that's the one that destroyed the west district of Senghenith Colliery.
Charles Baker and his father are killed instantly by the force of the blast. The York pit on the mine's east side remains undamaged. Mine manager Edward Shaw realizes that this may be the only avenue of escape for the hundreds of miners underground.
What he should have done to immediately get in touch with the mine rescue service, but instead of that he went underground to see what had happened.
Sadly, Shaw finds all entrances to the mine's west side blocked by fire.
Everything's made of wood, so it's burning. There's lines of drums smashed around the place down there, so dead bodies, what have you, down there. It must have been some of the lid blowed off hell down there.
Somewhere beyond the burning timbers and rockfalls are over 900 miners. Shaw has no way of knowing if they are dead or alive. Tuesday, October 14th, 1913, 8:15 a.m. Minutes after a fierce explosion rips through the Universal Colliery at Senghenith, hundreds of women and children from the village rush to the pit head. By midday, there will be thousands more.
And people came from all over the South Wales to the colliery, especially those that had husbands or sons or brothers working underground.
3 underground roads to the mine's west side are blocked by fire, smoke, and rubble. But there is good news. Rescuers have discovered that miners in the York pit on the east side of the mine are alive.
The east side of the pit was more or less untouched by the exposure. There was about 450 men on our side. But most of them reached the bottom of the pit, probably didn't know what the hell had gone on.
Mine manager Edward Shaw begins evacuating survivors immediately by way of the York shaft.
There were 950 men down in the colliery in 1913. Of course, more than half of them came out alive. And if people were now full of hope that their particular relatives would be brought out alive from the colliery, but gradually, bit by bit, hope diminished.
The fate of over 450 miners on the west side is still unknown. When rescuers finally do break through, they find fires raging on the Lancaster roadway that leads to the work areas beyond. They also find the first survivor from the Lancaster mine. Ernest Moses still lies behind the empty drams which protected him from the initial explosion. Nearby are the bodies of 8 miners who weren't so lucky. Beyond them, deep in the mine's west side, those who survived the initial explosions are fighting for their lives. Black, suffocating smoke and toxic gases search them out. Fires compete with them for precious oxygen and win.
The gas itself, once it reached them, it's within sort of seconds, minutes. If they were in pockets of fresh air, of course, they last as long as the fresh air lasted, but basically, if they didn't get them out within an hour or so, they were gone.
With water pipes damaged in the blast, firefighters must use hand extinguishers. Temperatures are so hot that rescuers can only stand a few minutes at a time. Approximately an hour and a half after the explosions, Edward Shaw finally alerts rescue brigades in the area of the dire situation. As more dead and injured are removed, the mine carpentry shed becomes a mortuary. Hopes are raised that evening when a rescue party finds 14-year-old Evan Moore, weak from smoke inhalation, but alive. Farther along, they find 17 more survivors, including Evan's father and older brother. Anxious relatives and friends wait at the top, hoping to recognize one of their own. For most, like Mrs. Joseph Lewis, the vigil will continue throughout the night. What she and the others cannot know is there will be no more survivors. The last of the bodies is finally brought to the surface in mid-November. The total death toll is 440, including one rescue worker. It is the worst mining disaster in British history. For 6 weeks, villages in the Aber Valley quietly bury their dead. Over 300 of the dead are from Senghenith alone, the rest from neighboring villages. The disaster leaves over 200 women without husbands and over 500 children without fathers.
I think it was 11 women to every man in the village after, because virtually every family did lose somebody. Some families lost grandchildren, children, parents, grandparents, all in one go.
Almost 40 children are born after the deaths of their fathers, including Josephine Lewis, daughter of miner Joseph Lewis.
I was born 3 months after, so I never saw my father. Everybody used to say what a lovely man he was, but of course I wouldn't know about it. I've got photographs. There's one there that we've got with my brothers, and and my mother holding me on her lap, and they have put my dad's photograph in the photograph from something else.
30 years later, a member of the search party returns one of her father's belongings, the snuff box he took with him that fateful morning.
And it must have been dreadful, so many people without fathers, and their wives without their husbands, which was a big thing, where I would like to have had a father. But I always looked at his photograph and always thought about him.
Miner Joe Davies must deal with the tragedy in a different way after switching shifts with a friend who dies in the explosion.
I can't imagine how he dealt with that. He was, my father, the same. Very private people in that respect. Didn't openly or outwardly show much emotion, but had a lot to deal with. I don't know, inside he must have felt pretty awful about that.
Newspaper accounts of the tragedy sparked public sympathy across the British Isles. King George V raises money for a disaster relief fund by putting his newly married son's wedding gifts on public display and charging admission. An official inquiry fails to find a conclusive cause for the disaster.
The West District was devastated and burnt out, and very difficult to find out exactly what did go on there. All the officials who had gone in before the day shift to check on the mine tech and the gas, they were dead, of course. Not all our crews. So even today, we don't really know exactly what killed 440 men.
The inquiry does point to breaches in shaft ventilation and the removal and dampening of coal dust, requirements specified in the Mines Act of 1911. Four charges are brought against Lord Mather, but most of the blame falls to mine manager Edward Shaw. Despite admiration for his heroic efforts, many believe more lives would have been spared if he had contacted rescue brigades sooner.
They were charged with the neglect. They were fined £15 with £5 cost, which was a ridiculous sum of money. And the newspaper, local newspaper, had this particular heading, "Miners' lives worth 1 shilling and a penny farthing."
It was a tragedy that should never have happened after the 1901 disaster. The lessons of the 1901 disaster should have resulted in an improvement of conditions in the pit itself.
The Senghenith disaster soon takes a back seat to World War I. Many miners volunteer, and some do not return. But still, the loss cannot compare to that black day in October 1913.
"440 killed in the explosion and 90 killed in the First World War. The explosion killed a lot more people than died on the Western Front.
There is one final tragedy in this cruel week, waiting to occur in the skies over Germany.
Germany in 1913 is a society in crisis in a lot of ways. It's a society in crisis because it's undergone very rapid industrialization. In the mid-19th century, Germany would still have looked as being one of the least industrialized countries in Europe, behind Britain. By 1914, it looks in some respects as one of the most industrialized countries in Europe.
Friday, October 17th, 1913. In Johannisthal, Germany, Zeppelin L-2 is preparing to take off. It is the pride of the Navy fleet, and today representatives of the German Air Command are on board for a test run.
The development of the Zeppelin airship contributed to the fears of Germany's neighbors. Whereas the Zeppelin aroused fears among the British, it certainly excited the enthusiasm of the German people.
Before the First World War, aircraft were not capable of flying long distances. Now, airships, it was thought, because of their size and long range, were more capable of carrying passengers for long distances. Now, the L-2 was a naval airship. It would have been used by the German Navy for long-range reconnaissance, sort of flying in front of the fleet, warning it of danger. The previous ones had the triangular keel, a structural member, inverted V, mounted underneath the hull of the airship that went from back to front, or front to back. It was decided to put the keel inside the hull in the case of the L-2. The decision was made by the naval designer that worked on the airship. That was quite new for Zeppelin. They had never done that before.
Like most airships of the period, the L-2 is equipped with cells filled with hydrogen, a gas that can be extremely explosive.
Hydrogen was the only gas available at the time that could lift an airship, and it was believed that the risk was manageable. The same thing if you look at an airplane today. Fuel is extremely flammable. Gasoline in a car is extremely flammable. It doesn't prevent people from driving cars.
The huge airship lifts off for the final test run of the day. It is just 200 meters off the ground when disaster strikes.
On the final flight, some flames were seen at the forward engine nacelle. Basically, the entire ship caught fire very quickly. Now, having lost its gas, there was no place for it to go but down. It's possible that the internal keel served as a passageway for hydrogen that had spilled out from the gas cells. The L-2 was designed with engine nacelles that were closer to the hull than previous designs. And once the gas caught fire, it simply went back into the gas cells.
All 28 passengers are killed, including the ship's technical designer. It is the final chapter to one black week in October that witnesses disaster by land, sea, and air. The tragic cost? Over 550 lives in just 8 days, and thousands more whose lives are never the same.
We're talking about a mining disaster in Wales, a train disaster in England, a Zeppelin explosion in Germany, and the sinking of a ship carrying immigrants from the Netherlands. In a sense, these disasters were entirely typical of the kinds of catastrophes that occurred in Europe or around Europe during the decade leading up to the First World War.
Today, the Volturno still lies at the bottom of the mid-Atlantic, a distant memory for some, but for most, a name lost to history.
For many people, the name Volturno rings no bells. She's forgotten by many and certainly has a place in a list of all the great maritime disasters. But larger events, like the sinking of Titanic, have largely expunged the name of Volturno from the public's consciousness.
In Wales, a memorial is all that is left of the Senghenith mine.
Every year for the last few years, we've had services of remembrance at the memorial in Senghenith on October the 13th, where the school children lay flowers to those that were killed.
It is part of their heritage, and I think it's good that they do remember it. To remember the hardship and the suffering of earlier generations, and to realize really the true cost of coal, not in money, but in blood and in grief and in toil and in tears.
What I think is significant here is the nature of these kinds of disasters. They're reflective of some of the important changes and developments that are taking place. It's significant that it's the mines, it's coal that originally fueled Europe's industrial development. In the same way, this is really the great period of European emigration. So again, the frequency of maritime disasters is reflective of these changes. It's been said that the history of the 20th century could be written around the development of the railways. The crash of the L-2 is the 10th Zeppelin disaster. It's not untypical. And it's also, of course, a harbinger of things to come.